Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's discussion about localization and why it's good for people and planet. My name is Dr. Michelle MALONEY. I'm one of the co-founders and directors of the New Economy Network Australia, and I will be your host today, although I'll also be putting on my AILA hat shortly and talk a little bit about the connections between localization and bioregionalism. But before I do that, I'd like to open up some slides so that we can also remember some important things, like taking a big deep breath and acknowledging country. Can I invite you all to just take a moment? You've probably come from a very busy morning or some hectic activities at home. Let's all just take a moment to reflect on the beautiful places that we live. And I personally would like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on traditional lands of the Cubby Cubby people here in a special place of part of southeast Queensland. I'd like to acknowledge the remarkable legacy of Indigenous governance of this continent since time immemorial. Western scientists indicate that Aboriginal peoples have lived on this continent for more than 60,000 years. And the acknowledgement of country, to me, is personally important to recognise the First Peoples' governance systems, their ongoing caring for country and each other, and also as someone who's a descendant from non-Indigenous people. I grew up knowing that I was part of the Irish folks who came to Australia unwittingly as political prisoners or economic prisoners. And I would like to acknowledge that the work I do, both within the New Economy Network Australia and the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, is really interested and committed in decolonising the way we think about the places that we live and love on. And I invite you to pop in the chat where you are, where you're from today. It's always lovely to hear from folks all around Australia and sometimes other places too. So today's discussion, we're going to introduce the concept of localization. I'm sure many of you know what it's all about, but it's always nice to have a little bit of a definition. I'll then change hats from being the host and actually talk about very briefly some of the work we do inside the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, which is connected to NENA's existence and work around bioregionalism. I'll then be delighted to introduce the first of our other guest speakers, Henry Coleman from Local Futures, the Economics of Happiness. And I'm looking forward to Henry providing us with an update about World Localisation Day, some of the initiatives that are going on around the world that we're part of, and other issues and trends that are popping along in the localisation world. And then we'll be turning to our beloved MORAG Gamble. Many people know MORAG through her work at the Permaculture Institute. MORAG will be reflecting on the importance of localising our food systems, and obviously she'll be talking about, I'm sure, the role of permaculture in the overall localisation space. We will have time at the end for some questions and discussions, so if you've got a couple of questions for our speakers, please hang on to them and pop them in the chat when we open up for questions. If you put them in a little too early, we might get lost with lots of the chat. So today's event is all about celebrating localization, and I'm going to let Henry, of course, talk more about World Localisation Day. But NENA has been a committed party or member of the whole initiative for several years. So we're really excited to be celebrating the concept, the notion, and all of the positive examples that are out there about localization. And before I talk about what that is, I just want to remind folks the New Economy Network Australia, or NENA as we call her, is a fabulous network. It's been around for about 7 years, run by volunteers. It's a really important space for civil society people to come together to talk about and reflect on the role of the economy, as it's often referred to, the economy, like it's some monolithic entity. The mission for NENA's work is really to offer a place for people and people and organisations to come together to discuss the economy, to reflect on the good things about what we would call the old extractivist economy, and to share ideas and stories and inspiration about all of the different kinds of new economy ideas, which often link to ancient economy ideas that we need to be putting into place in order to build strong, healthy society living within its ecological limits. So if you're not familiar with NENA, please have a look at the website. We've been a little quiet this first half of this year because we've actually been restructuring into a NENA Phase 2, which is very exciting, and we'll be sharing with folks a whole lot more about that in the second half of this year. Needless to say, we have a bunch of cool things to look forward to. especially our NENA conference, which will be held next year in Brisbane. We switched over to biennial or 2-yearly conferences a few years back. So we really hope that people will get excited and come and be with us. All right, so now I'm going to very quickly put my other hat on and just talk as someone who's interested in localization, but also committed to doing some of this work. And it's actually one of the reasons that I helped to co-create the NENA space in the first place. So what is a localization? It's about bringing the economy home back to a human scale. It's the process of building economic structures that allow the goods and services that a community needs to be predominantly produced locally and regionally. Localizing economies can strengthen community cohesion, lead to greater human health and material well-being, while reducing pollution and degradation of the natural world. It's not about isolationism or putting an end to international trade. It's simply about rebuilding human-scale economic structures by producing what we need closer to home. From community gardens to credit unions, from alternative learning spaces to small business alliances and co-ops, local economies create networks of place-based relationships. And that's the stuff that I'm interested in. Place-based relationships amongst human beings who create economies and amongst human beings and the non-human aspects of our world. That beautiful definition is actually from Local Futures, and it's off their website. And Henry's going to talk more about localization in its pure form through what Local Futures are doing. What I wanted to do for a moment was just reflect on a really important aspect, I think it's important, of the work that we do inside the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, which is my other organisation. And in fact, it's AILA that gave birth to NENA. So we often think of AILA as the mothership. So let me first define what I mean by bioregionalism. It's a clunky word, but at the moment it's still one of the loveliest ones that we can find. Advocates of bioregionalism assert that human activity should be defined and constrained more by ecological or geographical boundaries than just political ones. So rather than drawing big straight lines on a map, like we've done in Australia, thinking about the actual natural features of a place being the boundaries and the defining structures of how a society might live. For many people, this is a challenging or confronting idea. For others, it's completely natural. Well, let me show you some maps in a minute to show you what I mean. The key principles are about shifting the focus away from colonial, and that often refers to Western ways of thinking about national borders, more towards biocultural landscapes. And really importantly, within the old idea of bioregionalism, very strong focus on an economy that supports local livelihoods and enterprises, that fits into global supply chains where that's appropriate. There's a whole bunch of other dot points there. It's about building community resilience, enhancing the health and well-being of the bioregion itself, but predominantly often seeing and identifying human communities as part of the living world that they are based on. And obviously with a name like the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, this is something we find really important. Right now, across the planet, most human societies are living beyond sustainable means. And one way to help us understand our ecological limits and to design thriving local communities with healthy economies, one way to do that is to really think more carefully about how we fit into the living world around us. There's a lot of complex ideas and thinking behind some of these concepts. Bioregionalism as a term particularly gained some traction in the 70s. A lot of US writers and other people really trying to raise the profile of this as a politically structured concept. I'm personally interested in whatever political structures work to help people understand their local place and rebuild the way we live, work and play with governance. I'm not going to talk for much longer. I just want to share some beautiful visual slides and point you to some further reading if you're interested. Inside AILA, we've designed a program, that's the Australian Earth Laws Alliance website, earthlaws.org.au. We've designed a program called Greenprints. It's really all about having a simplified framework to help us think a little differently and maybe help us pull together all the various threads of what bioregionalism or a bioregional version of localization could look like. I'm not going to speak to this. We have a very simplified framework of the sheer complexity of life, but it's about really understanding ecological boundaries, understanding what the benchmarks are for health in a place, which is often missing from Western governance, understanding what a picture of awesomeness and thrivingness looks like. I just made those words up. And then working backwards to understand how do we change and connect all of the fantastic transition by design ideas that people have already been grappling with for a lot of time. The work we do is inspired both by people like Mary Graham and Anne Polina, who have been kind and generous in articulating the Indigenous relationist ethos, but also to deep ecology and Western constructs around bioregionalism. I won't speak to these slides. We are inspired by one of the oldest continuous bioregional cultures on Earth, which is Aboriginal Australian ways of seeing and thinking and feeling about place. Mary Graham calls this a place-based, sacralised, collaborative, ecological custodianship system. As she says, if she could make it shorter, she would. But that's the vision we're inspired by. And these are the Western scientific definitions of bioregions. And finding our place in these spaces, knowing how to live and thrive, is definitely a task for localisation. So they are some of the issues that we're interested in. And if anyone's interested in that, please reach out, get in touch. We've just finished a very small project in Lithgow using the Greenprints framework to help identify transition opportunities based on what people and country need. We're now embarking on a wonderful adventure with folks along the south coast of Queensland, now sort of known as Gold Coast, but mostly Yugambeh country. So really excited about that. But that's enough from me. I'll now put my host hat back on. Henry, would love to hand over to you now to share with us all the fabulous things you're doing at Local Futures. Thank you.
Hey, Michelle. Hey, everyone. I'm Henry. Thanks so much, Michelle, for pulling this together, especially when you're not so well. Really appreciate you showing up for this, and just the kind of long-term engagement that we have, the cross-pollination between NENA, AILA, and Local Futures and our work, particularly in Australia. So yeah, thank you. And good to see MORAG here as well, who is someone who's been really connected to us for a long time, long time, longer than I have. We started in a similar capacity, but that's another story. So I guess I've got about 10 or 15 minutes, is that right? Okay, so one of the things I'd like to start with is localization as the economics of survival. We've been using the term economics of happiness because the reweaving of connections between people at the local level is not only about reducing resource intensiveness and making economies more accountable to their bioregions and restoring democratic structures. It's also about building the kind of community structures that we all, as human beings, deeply crave. And some people who've been part of our movement have said this is one of the driving forces of the localization initiatives that are occurring in every place around the world and that we're celebrating with World Localization Day, is this innate drive to reconnect, and something that our souls long for, especially in places, and this can seem paradoxical, but especially in places that have been most disconnected, urban centers, colonized places. Those, those are sometimes the epicenters of the new localization movement. And of course, that's built on learning from Indigenous cultures and traditional cultures, land-based farming cultures. But it does sometimes come out of the city, and that's an interesting dynamic. What I wanted to add there, though, is not only is it the economics of happiness, but it's the economics of survival these days, because we are looking at a future that is unstable. So just to talk about climate, not even to get into the instability of global politics and geopolitics, but that of course plays into it too. But even just with climate crisis, we need to build up resilience, and resilience is a key part of localization. It's about building structures that are more nimble, more responsive, and less vulnerable in times of disaster. And I'm on Widjabul Waiable country near Lismore in New South Wales, and we saw that very, very clearly here during the floods, was that community sprang to the rescue for people. Farmers markets were central to providing food for people when just for a few days there was no food on some of the supermarket shelves in some of these places, and people were able to trade and barter and use cash instead of, when electricity went down and they weren't able to tap their EFTPOS cards. So that's just a glimpse of why we call localization the economics of survival these days as well. One of the things we've done this year with World Localization Day is to release a film called Closer to Home, which is now free to view on YouTube. It's 30 minutes or 35 minutes, and it features some of the key voices from the Planet Local Summit that we hosted last year in the UK, which was an incredible event of people from 20 different countries, or speakers from 20 different countries, and people from almost 50, I think, coming together to talk about what they're doing in their local places, and also how they're connecting to strengthen a political movement, a collective voice for a systemic shift in direction from global to local. So kind of bottom up and top down strategies for change. And so we've released this film, Closer to Home, that includes some of those voices, including MORAG. So I'd encourage you to go see that. I'll have to put the link in the chat. We're also screening it as a kind of online premiere, 7 p.m. tonight. You can find that on localfutures.org if you want to join. And some of the, that film is based on interviews that we carried out at the Planet Local Summit. And one of the key points there that people kept bringing up is that localization is really inevitable. The large-scale economy that we have is based on fossil fuels. It's kind of inevitably based on fossil fuels. Solar and wind, as appropriate as they may be for small-scale energy production, are not capable of fueling industrial civilization and the global economy as we have it. So the talk about green transition and about trying to meet the current global economy's demand for energy is I find it insane. It's really, we really have to look past that as a climate or environmental movement and talk about the need, first and foremost, to scale back the crazy energy demands of this system. And without fossil fuels, when they do run out, the global economy and the corporations will continue, of course, to drill for more and to try and meet it with lithium and so-called green metals. But at some point, it's not going to really work. And so localization is inevitable. And what we're talking about with the localization movement is about looking at that reality in its face and saying, okay, how do we embrace this transition to smaller scale, less resource intensive ways of living? What are the major benefits of that for people and planet? It includes more jobs, it includes greater well-being. But as I'm saying, it's also inevitable. So, kind of whether we like it or not, it's better to embrace that transition than have it happen out of collapse. So those are the kind of two paths that we're looking at. We're going to either continue with the mad globalization and techno-driven expansion and corporate power and ever larger scale and ever longer supply chains, or we're going to come together as communities, and it can be done in local places. It doesn't have to be a global thing, but it can trickle up. We're going to come together in communities and look at, okay, how do we rebuild infrastructures that are less resource intensive and meet real human needs in terms of food, water, energy, housing, clothing, just our basic needs. How do we rebuild localized structures for doing that? And of course, there are initiatives all over the world, which we celebrate in World Localization Day. One of the main things that we're trying to do with this campaign is just say, hey, this is going on all around the world. We can feel small when we're doing it in our own local places. But the fact is, there are all of these other people in other places doing this. So we're just trying to get that message across, which is a relatively simple message. But I wanted to point out the ways in which this global system is, the ways in which we could radically reduce energy and resource use without actually affecting people's quality of life. It's not about sacrifice. It's about using resources wisely to meet our real human needs, including, as I mentioned, that deep human need for connection to each other and to place. But I'm just going to share my screen because I've got some really telling statistics. Which one is it? Sorry, taking me a little. Here, on insane trade, what we call insane trade. So the global economy has subsidized, taxed, and regulated to make large-scale production for export cheaper, artificially cheaper, than localized production for our own needs first, as Michelle was talking about in the bioregional concept. But what we've got now is an economy that absolutely switches that, and we've got the US being the biggest importer and exporter of beef in this top statistic. About $5 billion worth of beef are imported and exported per year in the US. So almost identical quantities. Germany is similar with milk. Australia imported $1.7 million worth of bottled water from the UK in 21. $1.7 million. It's nothing like the $5 billion of UK beef exports, but it's just as crazy because why would we want UK's water? Anyway, there's the UK importing near identical amounts of butter every year. Australia and our avocados, 11,000 tons imported, 13,000 tons exported. Germany with its steel, about $37 billion of iron and steel imported and exported from Germany per year. And of course, there's some statistics about China and fuel. Germany is now importing wood chips from Southeast USA to burn and calling that biofuel, calling it renewable energy. So we're in a really insane situation with the global economy. So I just wanted to share some of those statistics to point out how bad the global economy is at using precious resources. When we talk about climate adaptation and climate resilience, we need to be talking about how we're going to use our tech, these imperfect technologies to meet real human needs. There is a conversation about kind of, trade-offs there. But first and foremost, the discussion has to be about how do we scale back the insane energy demands of the current system? And it's not just through redundant trade, it's also through finding ways for people to live in rural areas, which are less, revitalizing the economy of rural areas rather than encouraging unhealthy urbanization, which increases per capita use of resources, including concrete and steel, which are some of the most energy intensive materials that are being produced, all for these urbanizing, globalizing infrastructures, all for global trade in the hands of billionaire corporations. And of course, we know this, but to kind of paint that and then to see that there's another path forward where we're talking about localizing infrastructure, rebuilding small scale food processing facilities, composting facilities, business centers. In every arena, there are ways to rebuild the localizing infrastructure, and that's going to reduce per capita use of resources while increasing jobs and increasing well-being. And I think that's what the point I want to end on, is that localization, I believe, could be a call to action for people on both left and right, who vote left and right, because it's an artificial division in so many ways. The divisions between social and environmental concerns is artificial in so many ways. The global system is increasing cost of living and making our basic needs more expensive by the minute, and destroying jobs, destroying meaningful, secure livelihoods, making people work harder and faster just to stay in place. So we're seeing that when we talk about localization, we're talking about restoring small scale economies, small businesses, local employment, regional employment, issues that I believe can appeal to the small C conservatives, as well as the leading edge environmentalists who really care about restoring biodiversity on the land. And I think on that point, I want to hand over to MORAG, because one of the key things about localization is we shorten distances between producer and consumer. We stimulate diversified production for local needs first, which means rebuilding soils, bringing back biodiversity. And for me, that's so important as well. So I know that was a lot to cover, but I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, everyone. I'm looking forward to hearing from you, Maura.
That was fantastic. And just before we move on, Morag, thank you so much, Henry. A number of people have asked if they could get those facts and figures from you. Henry, with your permission, if you could email them to me, I might actually put them up on our NENA website, where we have hubs for all of our different areas of our member interests, and the localization hub web page is in dire need of updating. So we might pop that up there. So thank you, Henry. Really fantastic points. So often people worry when we talk about transitioning, how do we do that? It's so hard. Everything's working so well already. In fact, it's not working well. And there's so much waste in the system that we could make certain changes that wouldn't harm anyone, that are actually win-win-win-win. So anyway, thank you so much, Henry. And yes, a perfect segue to MORAG, the food systems. How are you today, MORAG?
I'm well, and I'm glad to hear that you're on the mend. Lovely to see you, and that you could actually manage to have enough capacity in your lungs to speak today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks a lot.
So thank you, Michelle, for hosting this, and thank you, Henry, for all what you were sharing there. You know, I think it really brings home what we're really trying to talk about here about localization. When you hear the facts and figures like that, it just is like really quite a slap in the face. You know, we go about our lives trusting that the system is kind of in our interest to make it work, but it's failing us in all different directions. And Henry mentioned at the beginning around, you know, we both started in the same kind of place in a long time ago. It was actually in Ladakh, on the other side of the Himalayas. And I was volunteering with Helena Norberg-Hodge back in 1992, I think, in Ladakh. And I had been studying about sustainability, sustainable design. I could tell you till the cows come home what the definitions were and all of that, but I'd never really fully experienced it. I'd grown up in suburban Melbourne, and my concept of living well, I thought, was pretty good, but it wasn't until I actually landed in a traditional sustainable culture where everything came from the earth and went back to the earth. There was a rich local economy and celebration, local community, all of the things that we've been talking about here. And I was left with this immense hollowness in our society, and this huge question that I've been tackling ever since then. It's like, well, how are we to live? What does that way of life look like? How do we reconnect with place when we've been so extracted from it for such a long time? What is the way to come back into right relationship? And for all the inquiries that I explored, I kept coming back to permaculture. I'd heard about permaculture since I was a child. I remember my dad had heard this guy on radio talking about this system, and I remember this comment that he said something like, well, gosh, I reckon if everyone had their head screwed on right, they'd be doing this kind of thing. Like, there was some comment like that, and it stuck with me as. And what I'm realizing now is that it's not permaculture. And one of the comments made in the Permaculture Festival of Ideas by Daniel and Crystal Wall recently was, really, it's permaculture's, like, there is no one way that we can address this. It is the multiple ways that we are localizing this way of reconnecting with nature, restoring, becoming resilient again. But it's also about deeply recognizing traditional sustainable cultures. Like, this is how it is to be actually really human, and to come back into right relationship, to become good ancestors. So I just wanted to share a couple of slides about where this journey has been taking me. Let me start up here, and hopefully you can just go to full screen. once I began starting to explore permaculture, I first started in the urban areas, in the city farm, but I quite quickly ended up in this place. That's where I am now. I'm actually seated in a studio that we've built from local materials, surrounded by food forests. This is Crystal Waters Permaculture Village. Now, some people have heard of it, but I'm actually thinking that it's something of a story that needs to be told a lot more. It's people experimenting with their lives about how to relocalize, how to bring ourselves back into a way in which we living in community, living with strengthening local economy, growing food around us, creating habitat. This beautiful bird that's sitting here actually is a stormbird or a quail. And as Michelle rightly pointed out when we were before we opened up, she said, "Oh, aren't they black?" It's like, this is the female one. And one of the things I realized actually as I've deepened my relationship with permaculture, and permaculture is about designing for one planet way of life. It's designing for bringing ourselves back into this place-based relationship, that it's not about us. It's not about becoming self-sufficient or all of those terms that we've used before. It's actually about coming back into this state of being in right relationship. And this bird every year comes into my garden. And there's a particular set of trees, or one tree in particular, that I'd planted, gosh, 15, 20 years ago. It's a Chatoot mulberry just off the veranda of my house. And I had, up until then, I'd imagined this plant as being, for me, it's what I harvest my mulch off, and it's shade for my little seat, and it's food for us to nibble on, and the kids had a tree house in it. But then every year, this quail started to actually come and land it, and the male would come in first and be calling out all day and night until its female arrived, and then they'd disappear, and then next year they'd come back. And I realized that if anything ever happened to that tree, if I did something to that tree, thinking, "Oh, I want to change my garden and chop it back and do something else," it would actually be impacting now this ecological system that is part of a global migratory pattern. And the garden is not mine. I am part of this landscape, and as I grow with it, I become the garden gardening. And the more I notice and slow down and connect with this place, the more you can begin to respond. Like, how do you tend to the soil coming alive? How do you tend to rehydrating the landscape? How do you tend to being in the landscape in a way to amplify the possibilities for diversity and restoration? Because in part of this relocalizing, it's really taking notice of what's going on in our place to care for it more. And so really big part of what we do is to open our spaces to be able to see how this is possible. So Crystal Waters Permaculture Village is as much a place to experiment as it is a place to demonstrate and learn. So within 35 years, this was a blank piece of land, and now there's well over 170 species of birds, 30 species of frogs, there's kangaroos, platypus, wallabies, echidnas, koalas, all living now in this place that as becoming good ancestors using a platform of permaculture, we're able to transform. But it's not just what's happening in the landscape, it's what's going on in our houses. And we can do this wherever we are. So what are the things that come into the metabolism of our life, and how can we create a more circular economy? So what the food coming from as local as possible and being returned back into the soil as local as possible, that the water is being collected as local as possible and going back into the landscape, which when we shorten the distances, it actually makes us think more carefully about how we're engaging with that flow. And it's really quite a radical shift that happens in our minds. But being involved in permaculture is, as I said before, it's not a me thing. It's not what I can just do in my backyard. It's not how I can just become self-sufficient. It's like, this is a we thing. How do we as communities re-engage with the commons? And this can be the common land spaces, common air, common water. And we start to see how together we can bring life back into these spaces and making localization more visible. So this is Northey Street City Farm, a place that actually tomorrow is celebrating 30 years of existence, and also the winter solstice. So a place that really helps us to reground, reconnect, refocus on this way of living in a more connected local community, place-based relationship. And again, this particular site, I was involved in starting it up 30 odd years ago. It was a degraded piece of land that had been emptied after the 1974 floods. And when we arrived there was absolutely no way that we could even get a mattock in the ground. We had to tend to the soil, replant everything. So if you ever walk down through Northey Street City Farm now and feel the abundance around you, know that in just a few decades, the possibilities of transformation and bringing life, social life, community life, economic life, ecological life back, it doesn't take that long. And I think this is what I really love about permaculture. It gives us pathways, it gives us tools, it gives us strategies, it gives us a voice and a language to be able to do this relocalization work. And it's something that, you know, just about every country around the world, it is myceliated to. And this is sort of part of what I've been trying to do recently too, inspired a lot by the Planet Local Festival, of really speaking up and connecting voices. So I run a YouTube and a podcast and global communications, but also celebrating annually around this notion of what does it mean to live a permaculture life. We invited people from Senegal from Uganda, England, Japan, all around the world to talk about what does permaculture and localization mean to them. And so all of the recordings of these conversations are now available, and I'm very happy to share them with you. But one of the key things too that I think is really important is not just to think about how permaculture can relate to us here in Australia or wherever. I know there's people here from all around the world, but how can we be in solidarity and also really address what Henry was talking about, the permaculture, like the survival, the economics of survival. And we work a lot with permaculture in refugee communities, in villages, across East Africa. And one of the things that I've noticed particularly is how it's giving voice to really finding ways forward that are addressing the impact of globalized aid, which is failing people, and also the globalization of the agriculture system, which is squashing out traditional indigenous sustainable practices. In Kenya, it's becoming harder through legislation to actually save seeds. It's becoming illegal to do this. So the care permaculture farm and the survival permaculture is really about passing on this knowledge and reinvigorating localized knowledge of how to live sustainably in place. So I'd love to talk to people more about that, but that's another big story. So essentially what we do at the Permaculture Education Institute is to connect people around this conversation of living a one planet way of life through what it is that you can do from your backyard to your communities, to education centres, to refugee communities, and finding ways to open the conversation of how that might be possible. Also partnering with Local Futures, we've been celebrating World Localisation Day all month. We've been screening all of the films. Tomorrow, actually, we're screening Planet Local twice, once in the morning, once at nighttime. I could share with you the links to access that. And also next week, Helena will be joining us in conversation to explore more deeply the permaculture and localization conversation. So you're all welcome to that. They're all free, and it's part of our monthly series of masterclasses and film clubs. So thanks, Michelle.
Thank you. Wow, what a wonderful overview. And as always, thank you to both of you for all the wonderful work you do. It's one of the reasons I love hosting NENA and other webinars and activities is hearing from all the cool and amazing people doing great stuff. It's very inspiring. So look, we've got about 15 minutes for a bit of a chat and a conversation. As far as I can see, and forgive me if I've missed it, I don't see any specific questions to anyone just yet. There's lots of lovely comments. People saying it's an inspiring international learning community. And yeah, I've been to Crystal Waters, of course, and it is so beautiful out there. Find an excuse. Do you guys still hold your markets once a month? Yeah, an excuse for the general public to come and have a look at your beautiful ways of living. So
yeah, there's a cafe that's open most days too. So yeah, definitely.
Oh, that's great. It wasn't there when I was there last time. So wonderful. So if I could come back to you, Henry, could you tell us a little bit more about some of the localization events or activities that have been on this week, just to remind folks, perhaps they can track down recordings of things if they've missed them. But yeah, it'd be lovely to just get a reminder about all the great stuff that was done or is being done.
Yeah, sure. So part of this campaign, World Localization Day, is encouraging people to host events, whether it's online or in person, that shine a light on localization as a systemic strategy for change. So we have a lot of different things in person. There's been seed exchanges. There's been obviously plenty of film screenings. There's workshops. The farmers markets have kind of dedicated their weekly market to a World Localization Day. We encourage people to do local food feasts. So we've had many of those go on. Sometimes it's just a small group of friends, which is sometimes the most powerful kind of initial locus of political work, is to just connect with like-minded people over an issue that is meaningful. And of course, bringing in local food as part of that is a tangible way to connect to those issues. So the local food feasts have been going on this year and last year, I think the year before that. And then in terms of online events, there's been very interesting, I'm not sure if people have heard of the farmers' protests in Europe, particularly, but also in India and in other places. We had a group doing who are involved in those farmer protests in Europe, doing a kind of, behind the mainstream media, behind what you'll hear in the mainstream media, what are these farmers' protests actually about and what are they saying? And it is around localization, about supporting the survival of small farmers in the industrialized world, which are in places like Australia reduced to less than 2% of the population in these countries, and they're at the mercy of big supermarkets and international traders and policies that are in support of that and in support of further globalization of food systems. So the farmers, of different political stripes have been coming together to raise awareness about that and to really demand that farming is not killed entirely in industrialized world, but also in India, where it's under siege as well. So there's an interesting discussion about that, and those recordings will be or have been made available. But yeah, you can go, I should put it in the chat, www.worldlocalizationday.org. You can look through all the events that are happening, have been happening, World Localization Day. And yeah, of course, the main purpose of all of this is to put localization on the map and to remind people that there is an active movement out there that is not about left or right or about a single issue, but about a systemic shift in direction towards smaller scale, slower, less high tech, lower tech, job rich, community-based, land-based ways of doing things.
Thank you, Henry. That's great. And we will get the links. I was just, before, I've got a couple of questions there for MORAG, but I see, MORAG, you might have answered one or two already, but just wanted to quickly remind folks, on the NENA website, the New Economy Network Australia was designed over 2 years by our members, with many, many Zoom meetings, to bring together a distributed governance structure. Over the last 2 years, because everyone's been really busy and times are a little tough, and volunteering takes a little bit more energy than some folks have, some of our hubs have gone to sleep. But I just wanted to let you know that what we will be doing over the next couple of months is reactivating all of our different hubs. I can't speak for the geographic hubs, but the sectoral hubs, which is a way for people to come together and to yarn about, share information through webinars and such on different topics. One of them is a localization hub, because localization is actually one of our 5 core principles underpinning NENA. So what I will do is I'll work with Henry. I might actually invite Henry to become an active member of our revitalized localization hub, and we'll update on this page links to some of the activities that are being run by, look, you can see here it hasn't been updated since 2021, but there are some great webinars and activities that have been on there from 2020 through to about 2023. So I just wanted to share all that with you guys and girls, and really do a call out that if you're on this webinar or listening to a recording and you want to connect with NENA Hubs, we're going to be reactivating a good handful to start with and go where the energy goes, because it's literally the members' interests that generate what webinars and meetings and projects that we might want to share and collaborate. Now, MORAG, I can see that you may have answered it, but just a quick couple of questions. I think Richard asked about, and you've answered, but for everybody, how is permaculture accepted in business and government establishments, MORAG?
Well, I was actually just bumped into someone last night who works with Department of Water, and she was talking about how they were all gathering together, all the different people from different agencies addressing water and agriculture, and they were going out and visiting different farms, and a number of them were permaculture farms. And so it's actually seen as quite a standard thing now. And I don't think it's kind of losing its, I don't know. I was going to say hippie, but I've said it. So there you go. I think it's lost that. It is actually seen as one of the core strategies that is addressing how we can become regenerative, how we can get involved in agroecological ways, and it's in its core practice. It is being really well accepted into a lot of those, and there's funding available for shifting towards that. There's people getting support to actually learn. So farmers are getting funding to do training in permaculture. So I'm seeing a massive shift in the last 5 to 10 years. I'm also seeing organisations, say like the Lush Foundation, who are one of the core cosmetics organisations, who have their core foundation of their ethics based in permaculture. And when they work and develop relationships with farmers, that they're looking to support permaculture farms to create the products needed for their work. So that is a big part of it. There was another question that I saw too from Pat, and she was asking about you know, when you get a lot of people come, I can't find the question right now, but
I can read it if you like. Any inspiring suggestions on how to invite and bridge with local, relatively new, multi-ethnic people, bringing them into our community and helping them be local? We have a lot of people moving here to northern Tasmania from the Philippines, the Pacific Islands, Nepal, India, Pakistan, Iran.
Yeah.
Back to you, MORAG.
I want to speak to this project by an incredible woman called Mariam Issa in Melbourne. She came to Australia as a refugee, 25 years ago. And she created kind of like a community garden in her backyard. And it could be a community space anywhere, and with a community kitchen in the back. And every month they come together and they share stories from their place. So they're bringing, you know, their food, their stories, their culture, and they come and they sit in circle and share it together. And so they start to get to know one another, but not sort of leave behind where they come from, bring that in to create a new shared experience. And it's just simple. It's about sitting together in circle with food from different places, sharing stories. And I think a lot of what I'm noticing, particularly in the permaculture space, and what we do at the Institute, is really about creating these places where conversations can happen, because we need to be able to share our stories and myceliate this. I think my theory of change is that, you know, change is not going to happen by knocking off, you know, like the top of the pyramid, because something else will just come up and fill that. It's flipping our understanding about how change happens. Change happens, you know, in the minute fabric of society, in our ideas and our ways of thinking, our ways of connecting. And so it is this myceliating network of people sharing stories from one to the other, and its strength. Like if you think of that mycelial network underneath the ground, it's what supports the forest, the growth and the thriving of life. It's the same if we translate into our social system. So how do we add compost to that myceliating network? Well, we create spaces where we can meet and talk and share and come alive together. And I feel like that is through food, through local food, through sharing our local food.
It's wonderful. Thank you, MORAG. I'm going to take my host hat off and my speaker hat comes back on, because I wanted to pick up on a couple of points that connects to. You mentioned, I think someone mentioned it, that the idea of localization challenging older notions in Western society that are leading to loneliness. One of my big interests in localizing and sharing and caring and connecting, and of course, in my case, supporting the Earth community, is helping folks in the West decolonize their understandings of what it is to be a human being, how we fit into the world. And Ayla's kicking off its first Introduction to Decolonization course, which will probably be October now. We have to push it back. And one of our wonderful speakers, Yin Paradise, if you've never heard him talk, look him up. I'll put a note in there. He often challenges you and reminds us that we're not who we think we are. And one of the greatest acts to decolonize the way we think and do is to go and talk to your neighbors. Because in Western societies, many people get in their car or public transport, go somewhere to work and come home again. And home is often not a place that they do connect. So whether it's with food or whether it's with having a yarn, I have found gardening in my front garden has made me meet and connect with everybody in my street and random strangers who drive past to compliment my paper daisies. And even on days when I'm too busy and I haven't normally got the energy because I'm working so hard, I'll go out and water that garden and I will always have someone to talk to. Now, this is just an ordinary suburb where, honestly, if I didn't do that, I would not know anybody because everyone goes somewhere else. And this idea of decolonizing how we think we should be human, which sounds all big and flash, but stripping away the notions of Western modernity and coming back to those bare basics of, put your feet in the soil. You have come from this place. You'll return to this place, care for the place, and reach out to each other. So I guess I could not express more or sort of support what MORAG's just mentioned about if you've got new folks in your community, or if you're new to your community, be that annoying neighbour that actually talks to people, because you'll be surprised. Everyone's pretty happy to chat back. But if you don't start it, sometimes it doesn't happen. And they are simple, boring, non-inspiring examples, but to me, they're really powerful. And the other thing I want to say is, and I think, Morag, your talk touched on this, I've been doing the work I've been doing for about 35 years. And 20 years ago, met remarkable community development workers, and I want to call a few out, like Ingrid Burkett and Tony Kelly. And they were the ones who reminded me that localization and community development is harder in Western societies than in others. And this is possibly a lot of what Morag's been talking to. We have built suburbs and societies that are dependent on cars. We go to these duopoly shopping centres for food, often, not always. It's really hard to find community. If you play sport, you're going to find that easy. If you don't play sport, you've got to find a craft. If you don't do craft, you've got to connect with your workmates. Like, I often ponder this as a human being. It can be so very lonely living in Western society. You can have hundreds of contacts and dozens of friends, but the actual day-to-day interaction with community, and I often pine in a very silly, nostalgic way for the old Anglo-Saxon. It was a very violent time, but the way communities in my former culture would get together in a great hall and eat together. And the idea of even a chieftain, and I'm not into hierarchical structures, but even a chieftain was respected for the biggest bucket of wine or mead he could share, because it was about sharing. And I often pine for the days of even my culture, knowing what it is to be part of a community every single day, not just random connections on a weekend when you go to the markets. So I guess that point is to say, if sometimes you feel localization or bioregionalism or even community building is hard, it's because it is. Western society is so fractured and pulled apart by the way we live. And let's face it, we can all stay inside, watch TV, order food online. We don't have to leave our homes anymore. What a devastating concept. I don't know, Morag or Henry, if you want to just have any final comments on that, and then we might actually wrap it up. But I wanted to share that because I see so much mental health problems amongst young people and older people in this country, and I watch it. And statistically speaking, depression, anxiety is on the rise in our societies, which are so very materially rich and often so culturally poor. And it's not any individual's fault. We were all born into these very strange systems. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, totally. I agree with that entirely. And I mean, there's a few points that I've kind of been noting some of the questions in the chat. I might address those if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I didn't take note of who wrote these questions, but there was one on invertebrates and localization. And, I just want to point out, like, working with the specificities of context is what localization is all about. And it's all about enabling that, because the work has to go on the ground, but localization is about reweaving the structures whereby we actually do shortening distance between producer and consumer, you become accountable to those relationships. That's fundamentally what it's about. You become aware of those relationships, of the different insects and what they need at different times of year. And you can accommodate that through, as MORAG does and as so many people in the localization movement do, by sowing diverse seeds and by kind of making a mosaic ecosystem out of your food system. I mean, that is the way we can support biodiversity and mycelial diversity. And localization is about enabling those ecological relationships, and I call it being an ecological protagonist, being actively engaged in the web of life, the story of life, being a main character in that story as a human being, rather than being separated from it and dependent on food that is grown with pesticides that decimates diversity. Because when you produce large scale for export, it's fundamentally unnatural, and you have to spray the SHIT out of everything to grow the stuff. So it's like, re-embedding ourselves in the web of nature is fundamentally what localization is about. There was a question on demonetization in the gift economy. That has to happen at the local level. That cannot be an exported, globalized relationship. To have a gift economy or to move away from monetization, you have to have a network. And so, we say that can absolutely start in the national currency. It doesn't have to be immediately a local currency to start to build that network. But once you have that network, that's something that can be transitioned into a very new economy kind of framework. And finally,
one more, Henry, and then I'll let MORAG have a final chat.
Yep. Sorry. And then just that question of working with the system and through institutions and policies. And, we have seen success in the localization movement, particularly with local councils, municipal governments, where policymakers actually are connected to what's going on the ground. And as you scale that up, it becomes harder and harder. And that's why we say what we need is big picture activism to build a movement that says no more free trade treaties, no more insane trade, and start decentralizing economic power into smaller institutions. That is a movement that has to speak to the national government. So obviously because that's where that change has to be made. So it is, it's not an easy task, but I think it's fundamentally what we have to do if we're to have a livable and happy future. So I'll leave it there.
Absolutely. And please don't get into the Western binary of it's either this or either that. Everything we do, whatever level you want to work at it. You might not want to talk to your neighbours. They might be stinky people, but you might want to work on policy at the state government level to help community gardens. That's great. The world is complex. The problems are complex. The solutions need lots of different hearts and minds. So there's no right or wrong. Just feel some inspiration to do something and you're on the right track. But MORAG, did you want to have a final comment and then we'll wrap up?
Just very quickly, because I think, everyone's addressed those key questions are in there, but I think it's a daily practice. So no, it's not easy, but it's something that we can shift and change every day. And in order to address those big picture, like we can make up our own rules, a different set of rules of engagement. We don't have to engage. We can speak to that and criticize it and point it out, but we can make up a different set of rules to live by and make a daily practice at doing that. And, showing up and being someone who's supporting localization and building local connection, local relationship. One, it can be as simple as a smile. It doesn't have to be really complicated. And the other thing to remember too is that being engaged in the gift economy is not necessarily just a human activity. We're all in this multi-species relationship. So really think about how we can be in that together on a daily basis. So
beautiful.
Yeah.
I was going to take the luxury of being the host to end on that note. You just remember localization is not just about human beings. Bioregionalism speaks to me because it actually locates localization in the local, but it says, hey, it's not just about human beings on this blank canvas. We live somewhere. These places are unique and specific. If you live in a desert or you live in a rainforest, it's going to influence whatever localization activities you do. Don't fight it. Don't fight it. Embrace the uniqueness and the specificity of your place and live with that and build with that. And by build, I mean sustainably build. And that's why I find it exciting, because nature calls to us to respond. It's a call and response. Don't just dominate the damn thing and drop a giant bomb on the place. Call and respond. Do those little things and love the joint. Love the joint. That's an Aussie way to finish this little webinar, isn't it? Look, I can't thank you enough, MORAG and Henry, for this. It's almost like flying by the seat of our pants, 1 hour reminder that localization is out there. But a final call out, if you're interested in reconnecting with some of NENA's work, the next 6 months is a great time to do that. So please stay in touch. Look up all the web links. I'm going to harass MORAG and Henry to help me update the Localisation Hub webpage on the NENA website. So visit that in about a week, and there could be some good things on there. I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much for your time, and go forth and smile at your neighbours, put your feet in the soil, and plant some stuff for the creatures. I think that's a good start. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Thanks,
Henry.
Nina. Thanks,
Thanks,
Michelle.
everyone.
Sarah,
Thank you,
MORAG.
lovelies.
Thank you.